We live in a time where technology changes rapidly, and as a result of increasingly powerful hardware, as well as an explosive growth in the games industry itself, new video game genres arise all the time. 5 years ago, there was no such thing as a Souls-like, now very broadly used to mean an action game with difficult and punishing combat. Heavy Rain is just one of the many interactive fiction action dramas with a heavy reliance on cinematography and storytelling. The visual novel has only recently begun its rise in popularity in America, thanks to games like Ace Attorney and the Zero Escape series. And with people spending more and more of their time on computers for work, socializing, and entertainment, it's no surprise that games like Cookie Clicker and Clicker Heroes caught on and paved the way for a whole new kind of game. This genre of games is sometimes called clickers, incremental games, or idle games. Typically, they involve a single, relatively simple core gameplay loop that converts your mouse clicks to currency. The general goal of an idle game is to accumulate power or wealth, not as the means to an end, but as the end itself. And while this might not sound so compelling, you really should try one out if you never have before. It's enlightening to experience progression for progression's sake in an age where many genres that previously eschewed character stats and other RPG elements are now incorporating them with surprising frequency and nuance. You could probably enjoy Mass Effect without the party leveling mechanics or the passive skill trees, but what about an inverted version of that, with no missions, no storyline, and where those RPG elements are the only things on offer? Clicker games are simultaneously some of the simplest games and some of the most addicting games I've ever played. I'd hesitate to call idle games fun, because their mechanical structure necessarily forgoes the traditional player-to-game interactions that allow for an emergent experience. But just because something isn't insanely fun doesn't mean that it can't be insanely compelling. For example, frog fractions.
Prevent the fruit from being eaten. As you eat the bugs, they emit fractions. My first day on the Space Force. I'm not cooperating, though. Honest! Oh, jeez.
It's a beloved genre deconstruction / subversion / other TV tropes terminology, but you're not so much in it for the gameplay as you are for the twists and turns of the experience itself. And in general, idle games are less fun per minute than regular titles, but are much more compelling per minute. But how? Clickers fast-track player progression at an efficiency that a game with a story or characters can't quite match. At the same time, they require minimal investment in player skill or attention. So in many cases, they're a distillation of the basic gameplay loop, that dangling carrot on the industry's game design stick. Idle games are a minimalist's dream and a thrill-seeker's bane. Of course, they aren't for everyone, but if you're a certain kind of person that enjoys what idle games have to offer, you can find yourself trapped by a highly addicting game that requires only the tiniest sliver of your attention from moment to moment. Really, try it. Go to clickerheroes.com and start a game. Kill a few monsters, make your first upgrade, and stop playing when you either get bored or distracted. I'll be here when you get back. Disclaimer, this video was not sponsored, endorsed, or paid for by clickerheroes.com. I have a pretty soft spot in my heart for Clicker Heroes, and I've been playing it on and off for the last few years. I mean, it's easy to jump into, easy to keep open in a tab while you work on other stuff, easy to forget about for a few days, and it's always quick to make you feel rewarded. We've already talked at length about flow theory in video games on this channel in the past. The general idea being that as long as you're balancing player skill and game difficulty to stay within this special range here, your game is probably pretty enjoyable. But if we try to plot out what a game like Clicker Heroes might look like on this chart, we run into a few major problems. There's no specific skill that a player needs or will learn, and there's no level of challenge that can restrict your progress, so we actually can't assess our flow through either axis. So do skill and challenge really have nothing to do with it? I mean, you can certainly watch a film or listen to an album without any prerequisite skill or challenge, but what about a video game? This is why I tend to believe that clickers are more accurately defined as compelling experiences, rather than compelling games. By definition, games have rules, failure states, and challenge, as well as varied input from players. But many idle games do away with all of these, instead opting for a certain dichotomy. You're either actively clicking, or you're waiting to click. This doesn't mean that clickers can't be deep or mechanically complex, or that they can't surprise you. Cookie Clicker starts off innocuous enough, but before you know it, you're in an eldritch hellscape. Clicker Heroes initially only lets you hire and level up heroes, before introducing ancients, relics, outsiders, and countless other slow burn mechanics that don't show themselves until you're days or even weeks in. But none of that requires manual dexterity or an analytical mind, although both of those things do help to speed up your progress while playing. And this really goes against the grain of what we come to understand games as today. If any amount of skill is sufficient, and the only challenge is whether you choose to play the game or not, we come back to the original question. How are clickers enjoyable in the first place? At first glance, most clicker games revolve around pumping up a single resource as big as it can possibly be, which you can then spend to increase the rate at which you gain that resource. For example, if you're buying buildings to produce cookies in Cookie Clicker, each building will produce a static amount of cookies per second. A cookie farm gives 8 cookies per second, a factory will give 260 per second, and a prism gives 2.9 billion cookies per second. Each of these buildings can be upgraded 8 times, and each upgrade doubles your production. So the higher the base production rate, the more effective the upgrade. And it's extremely satisfying to watch your production rate skyrocket after clicking your fingers off, and it pulls you right back into the groove of things, even if you're not necessarily within flow range. And unlike a typical game, where the mechanics get more and more challenging as you progress, clickers make your actions less and less efficient instead, with each new upgrade taking longer than the last. So let's try to flesh out our previously one-dimensional summary of clickers and instead say this. The cost of new resources gradually, but inevitably, outpaces your wealth accumulation. That's clickers in a nutshell. Again, looking at Cookie Clicker, buying a cookie temple increases your production by a flat 7,800 per second, but also increases the cost of the next cookie temple by 1.15, which might not sound like a lot, but it actually translates to a doubling of price every 5 upgrades. So the more buildings you have, and the more cookies per second you earn, the longer it takes for you to be able to make your next purchase. Your actions are becoming less and less efficient with respect to time. And a common theme in most clickers is that numbers eventually devolve into quantitative insanity. It's not uncommon for the numbers in clickers to reach such ridiculous sizes that they can only be meaningfully expressed in scientific notation. Compared to more conventional games with a discrete beginning, middle, and end point, clickers tend not to really undergo dramatic changes in tone, story, gameplay, or goals. While the currency you're gaining might change, it almost always boils down to trading your time and your mouse clicks for higher on-screen numbers, whether in the form of experience bars, gold stores, or higher-level zones. And if all of this sounds incredibly simplistic, remember that this is just a surface-level description of a video game. Just like how Mega Man and Mario are superficially about jumping and running, it's their good level and game design that makes these games fun. And idle games also build on their own foundations in all sorts of surprising ways, without needing to tell a story or developing characters. And while this can make idle games decidedly one-toned in gameplay style, it also confers an important advantage to idle games that many modern AAA titles lack, a subjective or qualitative success. To give you an idea of what I mean by qualitative success, let's look at the counterpart, quantitative success. If you die to an enemy ambush in Dark Souls, you invoke a fail state, which involves the game explicitly telling you that you died, and you get sent back to the last bonfire. At the end of your journey, you can count up all the times you died and have a quantitative measure of all the times the game called your failures. Along the same lines, when you defeat an opponent in Hearthstone, this is an unqualified success, a quantitative measure of your victory. The other guy, of course, gets a quantitative failure state when he loses. But idle games, by contrast, have no victory or failure conditions. You can't reach a point where your reflexes or logic aren't sufficient enough to continue. Likewise, there's no amount of reflexes or logic that will get you to the end credits because they don't exist either. So the barrier for entry is effectively zero, but with all the allure and satisfaction of sweet, sweet arbitrary progression. And since games do lack victory or failure conditions, then whether you're succeeding or failing is entirely up to your own mind. Regardless of your actual efficiency, your perception of progress in an idle game is unique to you and completely uninfluenced by those pesky quantitative measures that come from the game itself. More often than not, an idle game becomes more and more rewarding the more attention you're actively putting into it. It's just as easy to play Clicker Heroes for an hour in a full-screen window as it is to leave it running in a browser tab and just check on it every few minutes. And even after tens or hundreds of hours, idle games can still be compelling. Every upgrade feels like a success, but you never feel that contrasting sting of failure. You're encouraged by default to take things at your own pace, whether it's 5 minutes a day or 5 hours. There are no complex controls that require your dexterity, no complex puzzles that require your full attention, and in general, idle games will just keep on trucking until you've got some time to come back and manage them. Unlocks and new content can be mathematically locked behind days, weeks, or even months of play, so there's always a long-term goal for the player to shoot for. And the fact that a game can still surprise you after months plays heavily into what gives idle games such a long tail. I always look to a game called Trimps here that exemplifies just how skillfully this can be done. Trimps revolves around sending animals called Trimps into battle. You start in Zone 1, and every zone has 100 battles, but every battle is just a little bit more difficult than the last. It's not uncommon to reach Zone 25 after a day or two of play, but it can be weeks or even months before you reach Zone 230, which, by the way, unlocks a brand new game mechanic called Magma. This drastically changes the core gameplay, altering the numerical power balance that you've become so familiar with up to this point, and giving you something new to contend with. And even the most efficient auto-clicking program won't be able to reach Zone 230 in any meaningful amount of time. To test this out, I've had a game going for about a week now using an auto-progression program called Auto-Trimps, which makes the most efficient choices possible to progress. I'm just now pushing into the lower 30 zones, and it's only becoming more and more difficult from here. But luckily, every single zone carries the promise of something new, like stronger equipment, new jobs for your trimps, or a brand new mechanic that revitalizes your interest when it's begun to wane. So in a nutshell, clickers are surprisingly satisfying because they short-circuit the conventional gameplay loop into something more immediately rewarding, without the risk of a fail state. Then, once you're hooked, they provide numerical progression at a ridiculous rate, while leaving breadcrumbs about what kind of rewards you'll get next. And while they can certainly be played with 100% of your attention, they operate mostly on your schedule, so you can play them as frequently or as rarely as you want, without feeling like you're doing it wrong. And sure, at the end of the day, they're still manipulative little titles that take advantage of how games make us feel rewarded. But that just makes them all the more fascinating as an area of study. And maybe you're like me, where even after you peek behind the curtain to see what really lies beneath, you might still find yourself clicking away. Because why not? Hey, it's me again. We want to give some love to all of the patrons who made this video possible. Alchemic, Cyber Dryad, John Hathaway, Julian Detrus, Austin Yarger, Sea Bomber, David Lopez, Maria, Sam Myers, Delicious IB, Richard Flores, Hector Manuel Carrillo, Sebastian Becker, Useless Torch Studios, Moogle Girl, Cat Prague, Arno Benefice, Brian Hinson, Atlas Jackson, and Brian Feral Pony Feeney. Thank you all so much for supporting GameSoup. And for those of you who are not yet GameSoup patrons, you can check out our Patreon page for free weekly updates and some other cool stuff. Check it out. And lastly, a big thank you to everyone for watching GameSoup. Now, if you'll excuse me, I really need to go check my cookie production.